The fourth Kinnah, Shomron Kol Titain, is based on the 23rd chapter of Yechezkel. The prophet tells us, Vayhi Dvar Hashem Elai Lemor, the word of God was to me saying, Ben Adam, son of man, Shtaim Nashim B'nos Eimachas Hayu. There were two daughters of one mother. Vatiznena b'Mitzrayim. These daughters were promiscuous while they were in Egypt. And they were promiscuous in Egypt when they were young, when they were teenagers. Ushmosan, and their names Aholah Hagedolah. The elder daughter was Aholah. The Aholivah Achosa, and her daughter was Aholivah. Vatihianali, and I, God, I married them. Vatiladna banim uvanos. They had sons and daughters. Ushmosan, and their names, Shomron Aholah. Aholah refers to Shomron, the northern kingdom of Israel. Yerushalayim Aholivah. And Aholivah refers to Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judea. Before we go on in the Kinnah, it's worth asking ourselves, what was the purpose of having two countries in the first place? So we know that King Solomon, and later on in his days, he sinned, his heart went astray. His wives built temples to the various idols from which countries they came, and his punishment was that the kingdom should be split. How was the splitting of the kingdom an appropriate punishment? How, by splitting the kingdom, did God hope to actually make things better, to rid Israel of idol worship? Presumably, the idea was that by splitting the country, each country would try to outdo the other with respect to the service of God. Each country would take upon itself to do better, to look at its neighbor and says, we can be more faithful to God, we can be more kind to orphans and widows, we can pray with more kavanah, with more concentration. And in that way, a friendly competition perhaps could arise, which would eventually bring both nations and the people of those nations to God, to eventually then reunite under the kingdom of David. However, of course, that's not what happened, and the chapter goes on in great detail, first with respect to Aholah and Shomron, and then with respect to Aholivah and Jerusalem, as to the promiscuity, namely the idol worship, that eventually came to plague both kingdoms. First the northern kingdom, which is eventually exiled by Assyria, and then the southern kingdom, and God is ready to exile them as well. The Kinnah continues where the prophet Ezekiel left off. We are now post-destruction. Already, Aholah, Shomron has been exiled, Yerushalayim, the temple is now destroyed, and we see these women. We see these women who God had married, representing Shomron and Yerushalayim, and they are arguing as to which one of them underwent a more severe punishment, which one of them had worse things happen to them. In the Kinnah, each one has their turn. Before the Mikonaim, the author of the Kinnah, prays to God that he should eventually have mercy on them. Hachomel al dal, chamol al dalosam. The Mikonaim, the author of the Kinnah, says, you who take pity on the pauper, take pity on their poverty. So we have, perhaps for the first time, we actually have prayer in the Kinnah services. The Mikonaim, the author, is able to step away, as it were, from the tragedy, from the arguing of the two cities who are now laid in ruins, and takes it upon himself to pray for both of them. One can ask with respect to the Kinnah, does the argument really matter? Does it really make a difference whether Shomron or whether Yerushalayim underwent more severe punishment, underwent harder tragedies? Are they just trying to play who's the bigger victim? What's the goal? Why is it that the Mikonaim, that the author of the Kinnah, addresses this issue with respect to an argument between the northern and the southern kingdom? I think the answer to that question is reflecting on what, in fact, the discussion between the countries should have been. Right? The conversation between the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel should have been, how do we worship God better? How do we become closer to Him? How do we convince people to remain faithful to God? However, once the destruction has taken place, once both peoples are exiled, then the conversation has to be different. The conversation is now, what's worse? Who underwent a worse punishment? And while that is certainly pitiful and certainly mournful, in a sense, at least they're talking to each other, right? They have looked beyond their own borders to each other. And even if at the moment it's only to complain, it's only to try to say who has the bigger wound, perhaps eventually, as the Mekonen himself does, perhaps eventually they can step away just a little bit from the punishments that they underwent and undergo the concept of tziduk adin, recognizing the sins for which they in fact were punished, which does show up in the Kinnah, and then hopefully being able themselves to pray to God for a return of their exiles, not only for each one individually, but for the nation as a whole, for the two kingdoms to pray for each other and have conversations that are constructive in the service of God.